Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and greetings to all of you listening far and wide from points around the compass. Thanks for joining me, and as always, if you enjoy the show, do me a favor and share it with your friends, because Horsepower Heritage is a different kind of motoring podcast. I really try to mix it up here, so whether it's a short documentary piece or an interview, it's all about the people and the stories behind the machines. And I think you know I'm really passionate about this stuff, so share it, tap that 5-star rating, leave me a review. And by the way, I have to say thanks because you guys are a terrific audience. You're very loyal to the show, and I appreciate that. Can you believe it's October? Here in Southern California, there's a slight chill in the morning air again, and I'm happy about that because it means getting out on my motorcycle is a lot more comfortable. So apropos to that, my guest today is Paul d'Orleans. Paul is a motorcycle historian, a photographer, filmmaker, writer, curator, and founder of Vintagent.com, which is what I would call a cultural chronicle of the motorcycle. And by the way, while you're listening, open the show notes. There's a link to the Vintagent. It's one of those websites where you just go down the rabbit hole and you find things you never expected. Paul is a prominent figure in the motorcycle world, and he's kind of an evangelist for vintage bikes. And our conversation went in lots of different directions. And we share the viewpoint that these old machines, as cool as they are, whether it's cars or bikes, they're really just a conduit for our travels, our relationships with other people, and a different way to experience life. So I hope you enjoy my interview with Paul d'Orleans, and that's coming up right after this. This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. Maybe you can't afford that Shelby 289 Cobra or that Porsche 356 Speedster, but having a scale model on the shelf is easy with Model Citizen Diecast. They stock collector-grade scale models in 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, and even the massive 1/8th scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. And if you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout, they'll give you 10% off your order. Limitations apply. Just visit ModelCitizenDiecast.com and check out their great selection. From race cars to classic cars and everything in between. Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. And now my interview with Paul d'Orleans, right here on Horsepower Heritage. Hey, Paul, how are you today?
I'm great, Maurice. Nice to meet you. Thanks for inviting me, by the way.
You're absolutely welcome. It's a thrill to have you here. And from what I know about you, it seems like you ride all your bikes, which is really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't own a bike if I can't ride it.
And those are the kind of people I love in the, whether it's the car hobby or the motorcycle hobby. When they become static displays, it's sort of antiseptic and it's hard to relate to. And then their stories about ownership are very much centered on values and acquisition and restoration, but they don't have those stories about, oh, you know, we were in Death Valley at midnight and my fuel pump went out on the side of the road in my 356 or whatever it is, you know, or I was 2 up on my BSA back in college with my girlfriend and blah, blah, blah. That's the meat and potatoes, right?
For sure. It's all about stories. I mean, we really only care about people. I mean, how much can you care for a machine? I mean, they're beautiful, but an emotional connection, yeah, you can develop that after decades. I have a couple of motorcycles that I've owned for over 30 years that I have an emotional connection to, and they kind of speak to me. And I mean, they speak to me metaphorically in their presence, their beauty, the way they run, and the relationship I have with them, you know, out on the road, kind of the visceral sensation. And because they're old machines, they have tremendous character. And so, yes, I would say we have a relationship of sorts, but really we create the stories around machines. And that's my whole career is, you know, people often say, oh, you know, a good design should speak for itself. It's like, well, actually they don't. They don't speak for themselves at all. They're inchoate. You know, they have no voice. You have to give them voice. And that's what the job of a person like me is to know the history, to know where this thing came from, and to know, you know, dig up the stories that make it actually interesting to people. And hopefully to people who really don't even care about vehicles, you know, just that it's a good story.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I've known about the Vintagent for some time now, and I love poring over the website. There's always something interesting. My first question, Paul, is have you ever had a real job?
That's a great question. Yeah, I've always been self-employed basically since college, which was, I graduated in 1984, and I had a business doing decorative painting and murals for, let's say, I guess about 25 years. it was successful, and it afforded me the opportunity to buy a lot of motorcycles in the decades when they were still pretty cheap.
But you've never been a button down office type guy. I mean, you've always been in some sort of creative space, obviously enormously successful with motorcycles. That fascination started in boyhood, right? I understand that your brothers had motorcycles and they would take you out on their bikes.
Yeah, that was my first real introduction. I mean, I can remember being about 5 years old and sitting in, three abreast with my two brothers in the back seat of my father's Impala, and probably would have been about 68, and seeing this gorgeous blue and silver motorcycle pull up next to us. And I said, "Wow, what's that?" And my brothers, hit me and said, "It's a Triumph, you dummy." And that was, the beginning of my education about motorcycles. But yeah, they had various dirt bikes and street bikes, and used to scare the crap out of me, giving me a ride on the back seat and jumping over the local railroad tracks, et cetera. And it's a miracle I ever got interested in motorcycles again after such abuse. But there you go. They found me. Actually, it was purely practical that I really got into motorcycles, because I was desperate to get out of high school in Stockton. So I discovered that if I took a few night classes at the local community college, I could graduate a whole year early, which meant I only spent 2 years in high school, because I was in a transition year where high school was a 3-year and went to a 4-year program the first year I entered, which was as a sophomore. So anyway, my mother loaned me $200 to buy a little 50cc motorcycle, a little Honda, and I took my night classes, I graduated, and away I went. And I think I was so grateful to that little Honda for getting me out of high school, the horrors of high school, that I became intrigued with motorcycles ever since.
I think part of why I like vintage bikes and cars is, for me, it's a little bit of a time machine just in my head. And old cars and motorcycles just, and they make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Plus, there's the design element. If you appreciate timeless design, I mean, even a 1970s car compared to a contemporary car or motorcycle is a far more interesting object than the jelly beans we drive around today. It's like design has become so bland. Motorcycles hit their depth, their worst sales, in like 3 generations in the 2010s, because they were just ungodly boring. They'd just become appliances, and motorcycle designers could no longer seem to create a beautiful motor. I mean, even the engines were ugly and covered in plastic bodywork. And so for me, even before I really learned the history of motorcycles or cars, I had an affinity for older design, just considering it to be more beautiful. It had nothing to do with nostalgia. It was just taking the object as it is, as a designed object in the world today. I thought, wow, these are amazing.
Was that sort of a natural progression from the universal Japanese motorcycle era of the 70s, where everything became extremely reliable and very commercial, but it also watered down design in terms of individuality and eccentricities like you'd see in a British motorcycle?
I think it had to do with the design industry as a whole. Designers were educated in the same place, whether you're talking toasters, cars, motorcycles, electric shavers. They were all going through design schools. And I think it must be the fault of design schools. Whatever they were pushing, whatever Kool-Aid they were handing out, everybody drank. Plus, I think it's also to do with just how expensive it got to amortize the development of any product. So I'm friends with a lot of chief designers for brands, BMW and Indian and lots of brands. And they all say the same thing. It's like the number of units you have to sell to amortize a new model, which probably took 8 years to develop from concept and prototype to road going. You have to sell 8,000 units, which, unless you're talking about a lightweight motorcycle built in China, 8,000 motorcycles is a lot, actually. And, part of the reason Harley Davidson has survived so long is that they really didn't really make new models. I mean, basically, they built the 57 Chevy for generations. Now they find themselves in deep trouble because they've so attached themselves to an old design that the last people who care about that design are getting pretty old, and they're wondering, how do we appeal to youth? Which the whole motorcycle industry is having the same problem. Back in 2011, there was an amazing op-ed piece in the New York Times, when the headline was "Are Motorcycles Over?" And the writer whose name I'm not remembering right now, was a motorcyclist and pondered at, it used to be that a motorcycle was a rite of passage and a tool for rebellion and individuality. And he thought, well, they're just no longer cool anymore. What happened? And that coincided with really the nadir of motorcycle sales in the West. By contrast, in the East, in India and China, motorcycle sales were and are booming. We're talking 1 million motorcycles a month sold in China or India, sorry. And companies like Hero, which most Americans have not even heard of, are the biggest motorcycle companies in the world. And we are, blissfully unaware of what's actually happening in the world. So we look at a Harley Davidson and say, why doesn't everybody want this? Well, look at what 1 million people are buying this month and ponder that question, because nobody at those factories are. They're desperately afraid of making a mistake and desperately afraid of not, losing their shirt, their job, whatever, their place in the hierarchy of manufacturers. It's fascinating. I mean, we live in a fascinating moment. And just to carry on with that concept a little bit farther, I pivoted to including electric motorcycles in my writing and my books, my website, and my exhibitions from about 2009. The first article I wrote about an electric motorcycle, and it was designed by a world-famous industrial designer, Yves Behar. It was created by a local group of ex-Tesla employees called Mission Motors. And it was the world's first electric superbike. And it was a gorgeous design. It was in the Neiman Marcus catalog in 2009. But they never sold any because they just really weren't geared up for production. They actually made their money selling the throttle controller, which they licensed to a bunch of Chinese manufacturers. But I got a little bit tired of writing stories about dead people, to put it bluntly, and got really interested in, well, what's happening next? And I saw that the possibility for really innovative design was happening in the electric vehicle industry, especially the electric motorcycle industry. Everything that we think of as motorcycle, which is engine and gas tank and exhaust pipes, et cetera. Well, those three things are no longer necessary on an electric motorcycle. And so a designer is completely liberated to create whatever he or she wants. And I'm fascinated by that. I consider this to be the most exciting period in motorcycle history since like 1900. In 1900, there were hundreds of motorcycle manufacturers in the United States, and there are hundreds of motorcycle manufacturers in the world now doing electric bikes, and I'm fascinated with what's going on.
I'm glad you said that. I was thinking it as the words were coming out of your mouth. So many manufacturers then and now, it's totally mirroring it, whether you're talking about motorcycles or electric cars. Pretty fascinating, and it'll be interesting to see how it gets whittled down. And unfortunately, if history is any guide, it's going to be consolidation and acquisition, right? And
well, it'll be a bloodbath for sure, but people are still going to try. Here's something that you may or may not know, but Henry Ford was involved in a joint electric vehicle venture with Thomas Edison and made all sorts of promises. It sounded just like today, all sorts of promises and PR releases. And, we've got a cheap electric car coming out. It's going to have, a 1,000-mile range and all this crazy stuff. And, it turned out that, Ford's mentor was Edison, and Edison, of course, had a deep investment in battery production, and he had a design of these nickel iron batteries that were actually just crap. Even though Edison had sponsored a trip in England with one of his electric cars, and I think they did something outrageous, like 1,000 miles on a single charge, like Land's End to John O'Groats, theoretically on a single charge. And that was the run-up to his partnership with Henry Ford, and Ford sunk a lot of money into it and ultimately realized that Edison's batteries were crap and gave it all up. In fact, I'm sure he didn't even want a battery in his cars at first. And that's why Model Ts have a hand crank, for many years. And it took a while for him to accept, an electric starter and everything in his cars because he hated batteries after being burned by Thomas Edison.
Yeah, that's funny. I did know about that. You gave me more details than I'd heard before, but
yeah, and Edison really encouraged him to go into automobile manufacturing because he saw that this was going to be huge.
Yeah, interesting stuff. What was the genesis of the Vintagent? Because it's a great blog, and it was really a forerunner of a lot of imitators that we have now.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually spontaneous. In 2006, I was traveling a lot, had been traveling a lot, really around the world, going to motorcycle events and collecting super obscure motorcycles from around the world: Germany, Britain, France, Australia, South America, Uruguay, Argentina. And I had tons of photographs. And in the pre-internet age, I had collected books about motorcycles and magazines because there was no other way to get information about obscure stuff. So by necessity, so I knew what the hell I was doing, I collected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books and just kind of devoured that information. The motorcycle magazine from like 1902. So I had quite a breadth of knowledge, and I was asked to be a judge in various concours and things. And it was after the Legend of the Motorcycle concours in Half Moon Bay in 2006, where I was a judge. I'll tell you how I actually started a blog. I'm a big clothes fan. My mother was a fashion designer. I'm a clothes horse, totally. And I was featured in a very famous blog. In fact, it was one of the first blogs to really blow up. It's called The Sartorialist. It's a fashion photographer who works along the lines of the late Bill Cunningham did for the New York Times. He was a street photographer. He would take pictures of people he thought were wearing cool outfits. He featured me on The Sartorialist in October 2006. And back then, Google was sponsoring the Blogger platform. And in order to make a comment on someone else's blog, they made it easier, as their little pyramid scheme, to create a blog to comment from than just to comment anonymously. So I spontaneously called my blog the Vintagent, because it was a word I'd known for years about someone who's an enthusiast about old cars and bikes. And there you go. I started tentatively posting from October 2006, and people started looking, which was kind of bizarre. And within about 3 months, I was getting about 500 unique viewers a day, which my best friend, who's way smarter businessman than I am, he says, "Paul, this is your next career." I'm like, 500 people a day is a career? I don't think so. He was so right. He could see the future. He was my Thomas Edison. I didn't buy any batteries from him.
Well, that's terrific. I imagine it just grew from there. Now you have staff writers and photographers and
filmmakers, everything. Yeah, it's become quite a juggernaut. I helped start a motorcycle film festival in New York City back in 2013 and was chief judge for 3 years. But I was really loving this involvement with film. I considered that the Blogger platform was obsolete for me, but couldn't afford to create a platform that incorporated film, and it was more modern. So actually, Corinna Manthlow, who founded the Motorcycle Film Festival, said, "Well, I've got this guy who pro bono, he builds websites for giant corporations, but he's also a moto geek, and he built the Motorcycle Film Festival website for free, and his name is Sasha Cherevkov." And I said, "Well, introduce us. Maybe he wants to do it again." So I had a conversation with Sasha, and he said, "Well, what are your goals, Paul? What's the long-term plan?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to start doing major museum shows. That's kind of the plan, and continue doing books, but kind of move into curation and a little bit different cultural impact." And he said, "Great, I'm on board." So by June of 2016, we had the website you see now finished, which incorporates a weekly film and lots of writers and contributors and photographers. And Sasha and I started a nonprofit called the Motorcycle Arts Foundation, which is how we navigate the world of museums. So for the last 5 years, I've been curating exhibits at the Peterson Museum, and the Motorcycle Arts Foundation is the conduit for sponsorship and for the Peterson to put all this together. It's kind of easier for nonprofits to talk to other nonprofits rather than a for-profit business like the Vintagent, which could be seen as, let's say, exploiting a relationship with a museum for its own purposes. And, even though Porsche and BMW pay millions for exhibits there, we just kept it clean and started another nonprofit.
No, that makes sense. And by the way, I caught the last exhibit that you curated at the Peterson, which was Silver Shotgun, I think it was called.
Right.
And I mean, Ducatis and Laverdas and also the Lancia Stratos Zero, which amazing. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw it. I mean,
you could trip over it.
It's like seeing the Shroud of Turin, I mean,
yeah.
It's awe-inspiring. And Paul, you've got a current exhibit at the Peterson, which is entitled ADV Overland, right?
Yes, and the ADV stands for adventure, which is it's a shorthand that's used in the motorcycle industry for actually, I think, the fastest growing segment of motorcycle sales is adventure bikes. So, for example, Harley-Davidson just introduced their Pan America, which is their first adventure bike, and BMW's GS series is hugely popular, and Triumph has Scramblers and Tigers these days, and even Royal Enfield has an adventure bike. If you don't see somebody touring on a Harley, you usually see them touring on an adventure bike these days, because BMW has really taken a major stake in that, and touring BMW GSs are very common. But my interest was really about long distance travel on wheels and kind of the spirit of adventure, especially during COVID. This exhibit was delayed by 7 months. We weren't even sure we were going to have an exhibit, when in March of 2020, but everybody just wanted to get out and still wants to get out. And so I thought, well, what's more get out than overland, or around the world travel? So we've got several original paint 1920s and 30s round the world motorcycles that still have their bags, and that ranges to a new Pan America and the live wire that Charlie Borman and Ewan McGregor took from South America to North America on their Long Way Up series.
I understand one of the motorcycles in the show is a Puch from the early 1930s or mid 1930s that did a Sahara expedition. Tell me about that.
Yeah, the Puch is fascinating. It was written by a man named Max Reich, and he first took it as a shakedown run. It's a factory job. He collaborated with the factory in developing this into a touring machine, although you wouldn't think a little 250cc single cylinder two-stroke is a particularly apt touring machine, but it wasn't that heavy, and it has an extra large fuel tank and all these crazy racks and panniers, and everything is original on this bike, and that's why I wanted to include it in the exhibit. In fact, it was really the touchstone and kind of the genesis of the whole exhibit. I'm a judge at the Concorso Villa d'Este in Italy every year on Lake Como, and that bike showed up I think about 3 or 4 years ago, and I was completely floored, that someone had not only ridden this bike, for thousands and thousands of kilometers through trackless wastelands, but that it was kept in absolutely original condition. That's just so rare for anything from the 30s, cars, motorcycles, airplanes. I don't care what it is. It's super rare for a vehicle to be kept exactly in the state it was.
Yeah, that's amazing. And how did it survive the war?
Yeah, it was hidden away, basically. The fellow, Max Reich, was a wealthy fellow, and he had written a couple of books. Actually, he finished his trip. He did in 1933. He finished his trip in 34 with a motorcycle, and then I think in 35 he took a Puch Steyr car around the world. And so, he was kind of an important guy, and I think he was thus able to keep these artifacts safe, because the car still exists too. It's in a museum. It's in exactly the state it was driven as well. I'd love to. In fact, we're in discussions with partners abroad to take the Overland exhibit elsewhere. And yeah, I'd like to have a few more historic four-wheelers. I don't know if you ever read Coleman's Drive, but this crazy guy in 1957 took a Austin 7 from Argentina to New York. 1957. I mean, this was a 1931 car or something like that. I mean, what someone was thinking back then, taking a vintage, completely inappropriate, underpowered vehicle, over 14,000 foot passes on dirt is incredible. It's a great book, Coleman's Drive. Check it out. But that car also still exists, and I'd love to put that in an exhibit, because it's just it's about the story. I mean, he was doing inappropriate long distance travel way before anybody else was, and now it's a little bit of a thing to take a funky, vehicle long distance just for bragging rights, but he did it out of sheer eccentricity. We have one other fictional bike which you didn't see because it's only arriving, I think, in about 2 or 3 weeks. It's called the Tardigrade, and it's a NASA moon cycle. And it started out as a vaporware drawing by a Moscow-based industrial designer named Andrew Fabishevsky. And I featured it on my Instagram feed because it's just so cool. And then a friend of mine said, we licensed the exclusive rights to build this thing. And I said, you're crazy. I said, I really want it in my exhibit because it's cool. It's like the spirit of adventure. The ultimate is riding a motorcycle on the moon. So they used a lot of actual NASA technology, and they used a lot of DuPont materials to make this thing. And fingers crossed, international shipping is nuts. COVID, like nobody could come from Europe, until this November, theoretically, they can come. So it just became a mess, and we couldn't get the tardigrade until now. So we'll have a little bump in publicity when it shows up because it's super, super cool.
And ADV Overland runs through April of 2022, right, Paul?
That's correct. Yeah, we had to have an abbreviated schedule. We opened in the middle of July because that was really the first that the Petersen was allowed to open to the public. And it's super exciting to be associated with them. I think they're the best motoring museum on the planet. The building is spectacular. The exhibits are really well curated and always interesting. I mean, they're about to open their James Bond exhibit, which is fabulous. What timing, right?
Yeah. How did they work that out?
Yeah, right.
Paul, let's talk about some vintage motorcycles. I understand you have about 13 motorcycles of your own at this point, and they come and go, of course, as they do. What's been your approach to finding and buying old motorcycles? Is there a rhyme or reason to it?
There has been, for sure. I mean, the first rhyme or reason was curiosity. I was what you would call a cafe racer back in the 80s, and really was inspired by British rocker culture, people who rode fast motorcycles in the 1950s and 60s. So I started collecting motorcycles of that ilk, 60s Nortons and Velisets and BSA Gold Stars. And I was a really hard rider, very fast rider. So I wanted bikes that would hold together, under heavy throttle use. And that became sort of my criteria of buying an older motorcycle, something that could be cruised at a minimum of 70 miles an hour and preferably had a 100 mile an hour plus top speed. And so that actually envelops a lot of motorcycles, but mostly racing motorcycles. And I came to the conclusion that any motorcycle that was built to race the Isle of Man was suitable for my for my hard use. And so I kind of started buying racing bikes. And, God bless California, you can get away with just about anything on the road here. As long as it's got a license plate. I was riding genuine Grand Prix motorcycles from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s on the street with no silencing and no lights or anything, and number plates. But I had a license plate, and I even got, I never got pulled over for speeding, touch wood, but I got pulled over for other things, and no highway patrolman ever bothered me about the fact that this bike was blatantly unsuitable for road use. They didn't care. They just wanted to make sure I had insurance and the thing was registered. So I had many, many years of happy riding through remote parts of the state. I didn't really ride around town. I mostly would get out of town, throw my bike in a van and go out to the foothills or somewhere pretty, and ride around in the mountains or north of San Francisco in Marin County. And so those were my happy hunting grounds. And so I had many years of riding like that. And I think at some point, probably about 10 years ago, probably as a function of aging, my orientation started to change a little bit. And back in the 80s, I had owned a Brough Superior, the 1150 model, which was an 1100cc V-twin side valve. And that led to several other Brough Superiors. But I felt like at the time they were too much touring bikes. They really weren't built for scratching around corners. But
yeah, kind of a long wheelbase on the Brough.
Exactly. But I actually rode one in the Cannonball. My first Cannonball, which is a cross-country vintage motorcycle event, was in 2012. And I rode a 1933 Veliset KTT, which is a factory production racer. And then in 2014, I was offered a ride of a Brough Superior 1150, very similar to the one I had owned in the 80s. And actually, I rode it with my girlfriend on the back. And the bike was incredible. We were cruising at 65, 70 miles an hour all day long. It shocked the hell out of all the guys riding freshly restored knuckleheads because they could not keep up. I remember doing a rolling drag race on Independence Pass in Colorado with a friend who was riding a gorgeous 36 Harley Knucklehead, and he was solo and I was two up, and we just kind of looked at each other at about 50 miles an hour going up the hill, and he started to roll his throttle and I started to roll my throttle, and I just left him in the dust. And the Cannonball has about 300 motorcycle nuts. Like I would say the hardest core of old motorcycle collectors in the United States attend that event. And a month after the Cannonball that year in 2014, after I had a clean sheet ride across the country, two up at 70 miles an hour, the price of the 1150 Bruff doubled. More than doubled, actually. They went from about 50 grand to about 160 grand. And I was bummed because I wanted to buy another one. I had sold mine in, like 1998, and was like, wow, this is an amazing motorcycle. And I had to pay, real money for mine because I did find one.
Do you remember what you sold the Bruff for in 98?
In 1998, I sold my 1937 Bruff Superior 1150 for $13,000, and it ran, and it was complete and original. And I had to pay more like 100 grand for the one I bought. I bought a 1933 model, which was identical to the bike I rode on the Cannonball. I paid more like 100, which was a bargain because they were selling at auction already for 150 grand. So, I didn't complain. I mean, it hurt. I had to sell some other bikes, but, I was happy to have it.
Paul, where do you see classic motorcycle values going these days?
The price of mass production motorcycles from the 50s and 60s has plummeted. In 5 years ago, you would have a hard time finding, let's say, a 1962 Triumph Bonneville for less than 25 grand if it was immaculate. Nowadays, you can find one for 13. I mean, that's half price. 5 years ago, you could sell your Vincent Black Shadow if it was immaculate for $180,000. Now you're looking at 80 for the same bike. So and they made 13,000 Vincent Twins. I mean, they're not rare. So bikes that aren't rare, mass production bikes, the price has generally really gone down. But limited production bikes, let's say like a Velocette Thruxton production racer, of which they made 1,000 from 1965 to 71, those have gone way up, and now you're having a hard time finding one of those for less than 25 to 35,000. So basically the market is responding to rarity, and also there's that generational thing that you see in cars as well. People who have come to an age, let's say in their late 40s to mid 50s, when they have a lot of extra income and their kids are maybe out of the house and they can afford the thing that they always wanted. So right now it's 80s and 90s Japanese sport bikes are going through the roof. And I'm sure it's the same in the car world, 80s and 90s sports cars that guys, when they were 12 goggled at, now they can afford one, but they're 80 grand. Mini bikes are always really popular for some reason. Like I've seen Honda 50, like special edition Honda 50s going for $60,000 at auction. It's crazy. That kind of stuff is unpredictable, but really, if more than 10,000 were produced of anything, it's not going to fetch huge money anymore. But things like Bruff Superiors are holding their value, and certain obscure older bikes, really, really early Harley Davidson and Indians are huge money now. If anything's got a zero in front of it, 1906, 7, 8, 9, that's worth a lot. But generally prices are down, which is great news for buyers. It's a great time to buy. Let's say if you ever wanted a 67 Triumph Bonneville, great time to buy one.
I would love to get your insights on riding vintage machines. And, of course I ride myself, and I realize that depending on the decade, they can be wildly different, particularly machines that are pre-World War II are much more mechanical. There's a lot more going on. Controls were not standardized. Even starting procedures can vary widely. So just wondering if you could give some insight into some of these old bikes and just the mechanical nature and the feel of, just living with them.
Yeah, I mean, living with an old motorcycle is fascinating. I have had really good fortune. I'm a half decent mechanic, so I really haven't been stranded from a motorcycle in a long time. So, getting to and fro wherever you're going is great. I mean, I have had adventures on the road for sure, because I mentioned I've done the Cannonball 4 times across the country on pre-World War II bikes. And I've also done every year, I've been president of the Velocet Owners Club many times, and every year we do 1,000-mile summer rally over 5 days. And I've often taken pre-war bikes on that ride, so have tons of miles under my wheels on old bikes, and ridden them, on a daily basis at times. So the difference is you have to really have a relationship with your machine for an older motorcycle. I mean, you really kind of need to know what the heck you're looking at, and be able to diagnose problems, from a faulty spark plug to, dirt in your points to, a problem with fuel flow or a clutch adjustment scenario. And all that stuff it's pretty basic maintenance, which seems to be less and less common knowledge these days. But when I started riding in the 80s, I couldn't afford a mechanic. So I learned to work on my own bikes. But riding a vintage bike is a real joy. I mean, there's something about the poetic combination of a beautiful machine. The lines on these things are so elegant. Everything is exposed. You've got the angle of the forks and the shape of the gas tank, and then the angle of the rigid frame with a saddle on it, and the width of the mudguards, and the sweep of the exhaust, and whatever shape the muffler is. And that combination in itself is kind of magic. I've often said, you can't ride a Rembrandt, but you can ride a rolling work of art. Let's say like a Bruff Superior or a racing Velocet or a racing Norton from the 20s or 30s. Exquisite pieces of design. And they're shockingly competent. People rode fast back in the 20s and 30s. The lap record in 1930 at the Isle of Man was 90 miles an hour. And I challenge, any motorcyclist today to go out on that course and do a 90 mile an hour lap, but these guys were doing it on rigid frame bikes with girder forks that have, 2 inches of travel. So if you're riding a vintage, especially a pre-war motorcycle, you're looking for bumps all the time, which means you don't see as much scenery as you might on a bike with better suspension, but especially if you're riding fast. So you really got to watch yourself. But, the great thing is you can cruise on one of the premier bikes of the era at 60 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour. And it's just fun. You feel like you're doing something, be equivalent to flying a biplane or something. It's like this marvelous, simple machine with exposed everything, exposed valves, exposed push rods, exposed rocker arms, flying along, maybe even exposed chains. And yet there you are on this 80 or 90-year-old vehicle, just flying through the air. And it's a kind of magic. It's a very magical experience. And, I became obviously completely addicted to it, and spent years trying to capture it with words as well.
That really paints a great picture. The Cannonballs are like, what, 2,500, 3,000 miles long?
Oh, no, they're more like 3,600 miles long.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Generally, the motorcycle Cannonball starts on the East Coast and goes to the West Coast. So we've done, let's say, Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon, or Daytona Beach, Florida to, we went to Seattle. We've also done, Atlantic City to San Francisco, and like all sorts of crazy rides. And it's all back roads. So it's rural riding. And, I had not really experienced riding across America until I started doing the Cannonball, and seeing different slices of America from north to south at a relatively slow pace on back roads is it's a phenomenal experience and a real education. If you're just living on the coast or even in a big city anywhere, you have no idea, like, first, how beautiful this country is, really, from coast to coast. Amazing. From the Florida swamps to the Rockies. I mean, even 5 days of cornfields,
Is there a part of the country that stands out for you, Paul, in terms of just the totality of the riding experience, the road, the scenery, the weather, whatever?
Yeah, I had so many really special days riding across the country. I can remember, let's say, rural Tennessee, back roads through all these tobacco plantations with these crazy tobacco barns. And I don't know if you've ever seen one, but they look like they're half built because they're ventilated. So they just look like scrap wood, but they're actually functional, and they hang out the tobacco in there, and tobacco off gases tons of ammonia, and it's best to let it breathe. And I didn't know that until I was riding on my bruff with my girlfriend on the back, and we stopped just to check out one of these barns and take some photographs of the bike in front of this barn. And the farmer came out, and he was interested in the bike, and we were interested in his tobacco. And so we spent a few hours together and he laid it all out and said, this is, we've got 2 different varietals of tobacco here. And you'll notice walking through the barn that one really stinks and the other one doesn't. And they're off gassing. And it was just amazing. The history of tobacco production in the United States. And, it's things like that. And that really stand out in your mind. Plus the roads through that rural area and kind of the winding hills were just magical, with a lot of very old deciduous trees, which makes for a different kind of forest than we get in California, which is more evergreen. Another day that was really special for me was in 2012 when I was riding my racing Velocet. I had a lot of mechanical problems. I had completely rebuilt the bike from stem to stern, but didn't get a camshaft in time, and my old camshaft was worn. So I tried a random camshaft that was sitting on my shelf, and it was just wrong. And I seized my exhaust valve about 3 times on the first day. And so I did get a new camshaft airmailed to me finally, but I needed a lathe to make it all work. And we didn't get to that lathe until we got to Sturgis, South Dakota, halfway through the trip. But we had a day off. I spent a day on the lathe fixing the overhead cam and got the bike to run. And I was so excited because the next day we start going into the Rockies. And, there's an amazing photographer, Michael Lichter, who accompanies the Cannonball every time, rides backwards the whole way. He's got a big Asmodee or something that he's like set up this thing, and he's backwards on it and with someone else riding, and he's taking photographs of the other bikes. And so, I caught up with Michael Lichter on the approach into the Rockies, and he's trying to slow me down. And I'm like, dude, this is my time. I see curves ahead. See you later. He did get a couple of good shots of me, but all I could think about was, winding it up on these amazing roads. And that was another magic day. But really most of the journeys were just incredible. We're so lucky to live in this beautiful country.
I completely agree with you. And the back roads, no matter where you go, can be so enchanting. Definitely people need to get out of their bubbles and explore.
For sure. And meet people. I mean, it's good for both parties, the people that you meet and meeting them. If you do live in a bubble, as most of America does, actually, it's great to meet people and just find out, hey, these folks may live in rural America, but they're just people, and generally they're incredibly kind and generous. I don't talk politics, but as human beings, 100%, they were awesome.
Yeah. And, the other thing too, Paul, is a lot of us maybe tend to forget what a great icebreaker an old motorcycle or an old car is. It really opens a lot of doors. People feel that you're approachable, they're curious, and I've met some of the most fantastic people in my life because of old machinery.
Yeah, for sure. It is, as you say, that's a great term, an icebreaker. It's the ultimate icebreaker because especially more than in a vintage car, in a vintage motorcycle, you are completely vulnerable. You're vulnerable to the weather, you're vulnerable to animals and road traffic and other people. And so I think people, because there's no metal or glass between you and the world, people respond to that and are willing to talk. And, it's kind of extraordinary, even on a modern motorcycle, to be, in the middle of nowhere, in somebody else's turf. They want to know your story. It's like, hey, who are you? What brought you here? They love to hear about their own area and how much you like it. And, and these are the people that will tell you the secrets about the area and things to look at. And through those conversations, I found the most extraordinary places, that I would never have found otherwise.
Given all your experience, if somebody came to you and said, I want to get into vintage bikes, what do you tell them? What do you recommend? How should somebody start?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is predicated on, if they have any mechanical skill or not. If they really don't have mechanical skill, I'd say, go for a German bike, buy a BMW. I mean, you'll still have a few problems, but they tend not to be as severe. But time is passing. I started out in this game in the 1980s, and the 1974 Ducati 750 GT I bought, the bike was only 5 years old, and it was already considered a classic, and an icon of good design. But now, that bike is over 40 years old, and either it's been used or it hasn't been used properly. How many people have worked on it in those decades? So if you have mechanical skill, something that has a easy parts availability, like let's say a 60s Triumph Twin or a early 70s Norton Commando, where you can literally get anything. And then if you get bitten by the bug, you can go in for the Exotica, where you're probably going to have to fabricate a part or two, if something ever goes wrong, or you make an international network of fellow enthusiasts. I mean, I have to say that's probably the greatest thing about any collecting hobby, but especially if you are into the obscure, you will meet amazing people for sure, all around the world. And these days it's easier than ever. Like just this morning, I was contacted by an old gentleman whose grandfather had been a development engineer for Velocet. And his wife was a factory rider for Velocet and Bruff Superior in the 20s. And, he's sending me photographs and things. And that's kind of the tangential reward of digging into old vehicles, especially. But, there's a particular reward about old motorcycles, which is there's a real magic about riding a beautiful motorcycle. It's like that miracle of physics of two wheels, balancing down the road, and the play with gravity. There's just something special about that extra ingredient, which is a vintage motorcycle.
Paul de Orleans, thanks for joining me today. Sincerely, it's a joy to speak with you, Paul. So much fun.
I can go on and on.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. If you like what you've heard, don't forget to follow the podcast, tell your friends about it, and leave me 5 stars and a quick review. buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage if you want to support the show that way. Always appreciated. Read articles and watch videos at horsepowerheritage.com. The Instagram is what else but at Horsepower Heritage. There's links in the show notes to all this stuff. And until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.